don't go camping anymore. Not because I don't love it, I used to. The quiet of the woods, the smell of damp earth, the way the stars stretch across the sky with no city lights to drown them out. There was something peaceful about being out there, just me and nature. But all of that changed one night, deep in the forests of northern Michigan. I don't talk about it much. I don't even like to think about it, honestly. But every now and then, when I'm lying in bed in the middle of the night, I'll hear something outside. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, and it all comes rushing back. The fear, the helplessness, that feeling of being watched. I'm writing this now because people keep saying they've seen something out there. The same thing I saw. And if they don't listen, they won't come back. It was early October, just as the leaves were starting to turn. My plan was simple: 3 days in the woods, solo. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, my gear, and the quiet. I'd been camping alone plenty of times before, so I wasn't worried. I had my tent, a good knife, a rifle just in case, and enough food to last me through the weekend. I parked my truck at the edge of a dirt road, hiked about 5 miles in, and found a nice clearing near a small creek. The first day was perfect. I set up camp, gathered some wood, and spent the afternoon fishing. The air was crisp. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush, probably just deer. As night fell, I built a fire, cooked some fish, and sat back to enjoy the silence. There's something about being alone in the woods that makes the world feel bigger. The trees stretch taller, the darkness feels deeper, and every sound seems sharper. I slept like a rock that night, wrapped in my sleeping bag with the fire still glowing outside my tent. I wish I'd left the next morning. I woke up early, made some coffee, and set out for a long hike. I didn't have a set trail, just my map and compass, so I wandered, letting the landscape guide me. I saw fresh deer tracks, a few squirrels darting between trees, and even a set of bear prints near the creek. But around midday, I noticed something strange. The woods had gone silent. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots on the ground. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a predator nearby, something the animals could sense before I did. But as I walked, I started seeing signs that something was off. Broken branches, deep claw marks in tree trunks, like something big had scraped against them. I even found a dead deer, its body torn open. Not eaten, just ripped apart. That's when the uneasy feeling started, like I was being watched. I pushed it aside and hiked back to camp, trying to shake the paranoia. But by the time I got there, the sun was already starting to dip, and that feeling hadn't gone away. I kept my fire bigger that night. As I cooked dinner, I kept glancing around, listening. The usual sounds of the forest had started up again, but something felt wrong, like there was something just beyond the tree line, standing still, waiting. I told myself I was being ridiculous, just my mind playing tricks. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. A howl. Not a wolf, not a coyote. Something deeper, more guttural. It echoed through the trees, long and slow, and I swear I felt it in my chest. I grabbed my rifle and sat by the fire, scanning the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I knew it was out there. The howls came again, closer this time. Then silence. Nothing moved, not even the wind. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something breathing just outside my tent. I should have left that morning, packed up, hiked out, and never looked back. But I didn't. I told myself it was just an animal, that I was overreacting. I even laughed at myself as I made breakfast, convincing myself I'd let the darkness get to me. Then I found the footprints. They weren't human. Too long, too narrow, with deep claw marks in the dirt. They circled my campsite, passing within feet of my tent. I packed my gear in record time. I kept my rifle in my hands as I walked, my head on a swivel. The woods were quiet again, that same eerie, unnatural silence. Then the smell hit me, rotting meat, thick and heavy in the air. I picked up my pace. Something moved in the trees to my left, a shadow just out of sight. Then another behind me. I stopped, gripping my rifle, trying to keep my breathing steady. A branch snapped. I turned, and that's when I saw it. Tall, too tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Thin but muscular, covered in dark fur. Its head was canine, long snout, pointed ears, but its eyes, they weren't right. Too intelligent, too focused. It stood on 2 legs, watching me. I raised my rifle. It moved fast, too fast. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, disappearing into the trees like a ghost. But I could still hear it, circling, stalking. I ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I saw my truck, I was gasping for breath, my legs burning. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and tore down that dirt road without looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was just a bear or a trick of the light or exhaustion. But then I started hearing the stories. Hunters going missing, campers finding shredded tents. The same howls, the same footprints. People keep saying they see something out there. I know they do, because I saw it too. And if they don't listen, they won't come back. I've always loved the wilderness. There's something about being deep in the woods, miles from another person, that makes me feel more at home than anywhere else. No traffic, no noise, no distractions. Just the sound of my own breathing and the rhythm of my footsteps. That's why I chose this trip. I had a week off work, and I wanted to do something big, something remote, something that pushed my limits. I found an area in northern Idaho that barely showed up on hiking forums. The kind of place where people don't go unless they really know what they're doing. No marked trails, no campgrounds, just deep, rugged wilderness. That was exactly what I wanted. I planned a 4-day trek, making a loop through the mountains, following old logging roads and game trails. My pack was heavy with supplies, food, water filter, first aid kit, emergency beacon, everything I needed. I wasn't worried. I'd done trips like this before, but I hadn't done one here, and I hadn't met here. The first day went smoothly. I parked my truck at an old trailhead, if you could even call it that. The road had been abandoned for years, barely passable, just ruts in the dirt cutting through thick pines. I locked the doors, slung my pack over my shoulders, and stepped into the trees. The forest swallowed me instantly. It was dense here, the kind of dense where the sunlight barely touches the ground, where the air feels thicker, heavier. The trail, if it had ever been one, was barely visible, just a faint path winding between trees, overgrown with ferns and deadfall. I moved fast, covering miles before midday. My GPS worked fine, tracking my progress, marking waypoints. I had a paper map too, just in case. Everything was going according to plan. Then I saw the footprints. Not mine. They were faint, barely impressions in the damp earth. But they were there. Small, barefoot, the toes dug deep into the mud, like whoever made them had been walking on their toes. I stopped, looked around. Nothing, just trees and silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had made them, distorted by the rain. Maybe someone had come through here before me. But why barefoot? I kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing near a creek, a perfect campsite. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and sat back, listening to the sounds of the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. Then I felt it, a shift. Not the temperature, not the wind, something else. The silence had changed. Before, there had been the usual forest sounds. Birds, rustling leaves, distant insects. But now, nothing, like the woods were holding their breath. I stared into the trees, scanning the darkness between them. My skin prickled. I had the sudden, undeniable feeling that someone was watching me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I forced myself to eat, to drink, to go through my normal routine. I zipped myself into my tent, listening, waiting for some sign that I wasn't alone. Nothing came. I woke early. The fire was cold, the woods still silent. My first thought was that something had been near my camp last night, something that had scared off the wildlife. A bear? A cougar? I checked around the campsite. No tracks, no signs of anything. but the feeling hadn't left me. I packed up quickly and started hiking again, following my planned route deeper into the forest. The trees closed in tighter, the trail more difficult to follow. That's when I found the second set of footprints. These were clearer, fresh, still barefoot, still small, but now they were different. They weren't just crossing the trail, they were following it. Following me. I swallowed hard, looked over my shoulder. The trees stood still, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I wasn't alone out here. I picked up my pace. Hours passed. The sun climbed high. I told myself over and over that I was imagining things, that I was overreacting, that I was fine. Then I saw her. She was standing at the tree line, half hidden behind a trunk, barely visible through the branches. A woman, thin, pale, wearing a long, tattered dress, stained dark with dirt. Her hair hung in tangled knots around her face. She didn't move, just stood there, watching me. My whole body went cold. I kept walking, forcing myself not to speed up, not to run. My pulse hammered in my ears. I glanced back once. She was gone. Day 3. I didn't sleep that night. I had hiked as far as I could before nightfall, set up camp in a new spot, built my fire bigger than before. I kept my knife close, my flashlight in my hand. But she never came. Not that I saw. By morning, I was exhausted, but I had one goal: get back to my truck. I checked my GPS. I had strayed off course, trying to put distance between myself and her. I adjusted my route, cutting straight through the forest instead of following my planned loop. It was slower, harder. The underbrush was thick, the ground uneven. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. The feeling never left me. By afternoon, I knew I was close to the road, maybe an hour away. Then I saw something ahead of me, hanging from a tree, a bundle of sticks, tied together with a strip of fabric. I stepped closer. The fabric was old, stained, and I recognized it. It was from her dress. That was when I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, scraping, a slow, dragging sound, like something sharp being pulled against tree bark. Close, too close. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, my pack bouncing against my shoulders. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until the trees thinned, until the dirt path turned to gravel, until my truck, right where I left it. I fumbled with my keys, throwing myself inside, slamming the doors locked. My breath came in ragged gasps. My hands shook as I started the engine. I looked up. She was standing at the edge of the trees, still, watching. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into gear, tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the old logging road. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me that I saw some woman, deep in the woods, barefoot and silent, that she had been following me? Maybe she was just living out there. Maybe she was harmless. But I know what I felt. And sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in the woods, I get the same feeling. Like someone is watching. And every so often, I see them. Footprints. Bare. Small. Too small to be mine. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. A short hike in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd taken this route before. Nothing more than a few hours walk through familiar trails. The kind of thing you do to unwind, not expecting anything to change. But tonight, things felt different. I'd left home around dusk, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The woods were still lit by the last rays of light, casting long shadows across the path ahead. The air was cool, with the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I had my backpack with a bottle of water, some snacks, and a flashlight just in case. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before and knew these woods like the back of my hand. I hadn't planned on staying too long, but as I walked, the beauty of the forest drew me in. The way the trees lined the path, their branches reaching out like a canopy, made it feel like I was walking in a secret world. The chirping of birds had died down, but there were still the occasional rustles in the underbrush, a rabbit or a squirrel, maybe a fox. It was peaceful, almost soothing. The sun set faster than I expected, and soon, the woods were plunged into a thick, inky darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the shadows, but even with the flashlight, the woods felt oppressive. The trees seemed taller now, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots against the dirt and leaves, and my own breathing, steady but a little quicker than usual. I'd planned to reach the creek by nightfall. The sound of water would make for a perfect spot to sit and take a break. But by the time I arrived at the usual clearing near the stream, something felt off. The place seemed quieter than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a step into the clearing, my flashlight casting long, strange shadows over the ground. I stopped and looked around. There was no wind, no sound, just the stillness. For a moment, I wondered if I'd missed something. The creek usually had a certain noise, the trickling of water over rocks, but it was eerily quiet. I glanced at the stream, and sure enough, there was no water. The creek was dry. It wasn't just low, it was completely barren. I walked over to the bank and knelt down to inspect it. The ground was cracked, the dirt parched. No water had flowed through here in days, maybe weeks. I couldn't understand it. There was no logical reason for a creek to dry up like this in the middle of summer. I rubbed the back of my neck, uneasy. This place had always been here, and it had always had water. I stood up, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. A rustle came from the trees behind me, just on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a small noise, like a squirrel. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something larger had moved through the brush. I turned, shining the light in the direction of the noise, but the beam only revealed a few tangled branches and some low bushes. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stood still for a moment, listening. The rustling had stopped. I should have turned back. Something about the woods felt different tonight, and my instinct was screaming at me to leave. But instead, I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. There was nothing out here. I couldn't be the only one in these woods. People hiked here all the time. I moved deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that would eventually lead back to the parking lot. But with every step, the air seemed to thicken. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and the path became less defined. It was as if the forest was swallowing me whole. I should have been able to find my way back by now, but the darkness made everything look unfamiliar. I checked my watch. It wasn't that late, but something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. My flashlight beam shook as I turned around, checking behind me, but there was nothing. No sounds of animals, no distant rustling, no wind, just an oppressive silence. I walked faster now, my heart beginning to beat harder in my chest. The trees seemed to be growing closer together, the branches tangled in a way that made it feel like the path was narrowing. It was harder to see even with the flashlight. The beam of light flickered for a second, and when it came back on, the forest had changed. It wasn't the same. The trees seemed more twisted, their bark dark and rough. The branches gnarled like fingers reaching out to grab me. The path ahead was now barely visible. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. The woods had always been dark at night, but this wasn't just darkness. It was something more. I turned around, but there was no sign of the clearing, no sign of the creek. I was deep in the woods now, and the path I had been following had disappeared completely. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that I had no idea where I was. My phone was in my backpack, but I hadn't thought to check it. Now, I didn't want to. I could feel it. The woods were alive in a way they hadn't been before. I tried to move forward, but the trees now seemed to block my way. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on me. I stepped off the path and into the brush, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the ground seemed to give way underneath me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting as I caught myself on a nearby tree. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out. I pushed forward, my mind racing. I was lost, completely lost. The flashlight was the only thing that kept me from completely losing my bearings, but the beam was weak now, flickering with every step. I didn't know how much longer the batteries would last. Suddenly, I heard it again, a sound from behind me, the rustling, that same deliberate movement through the brush. This time, it was closer, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just trees, shadows. I froze. A shape moved in the distance just at the edge of the light. It was large, too large to be an animal. I blinked, trying to focus, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes. My throat tightened, and I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, just the wind. But something inside me screamed to run, and so I did. I bolted down the path, my legs aching, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went black. I cursed under my breath, desperately tapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered back to life, and I saw it. The figure. It was moving through the trees, following me. It wasn't human. The shape was too tall, too long. Its movement wasn't natural. It glided between the trees, almost as if it was floating. My stomach churned with a wave of nausea. Couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move fast enough, and I could hear it gaining on me. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my pulse roaring in my ears. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and kept going, my only thought to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods that I stopped. I didn't know how far I had run, but I could see the dim outline of the road ahead. The forest seemed to recede behind me, as though I had crossed some invisible line. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it in the pit of my stomach. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. And even then, I didn't feel safe. The woods had changed. The trees had closed in on me in a way that was unnatural. Whatever had followed me, whatever it was, I didn't want to know. I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel, and didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain the twisted trees, the way the forest seemed alive, or the thing I had felt watching me. All I knew was that I would never go back into those woods. Not ever. I've been hiking solo for years. Something about being alone in the woods always felt right to me. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of moving through untouched nature without a schedule or responsibility. It cleared my head like nothing else could. That's why I took the trip. It was late September, just as summer was starting to fade into fall. The days were still warm, but the nights had that creeping cold that reminded you winter wasn't far away. Perfect hiking weather. I had planned for a 2-day trek, one night in the woods, nothing extreme, just a break from normal life. The trail I picked wasn't popular. That was intentional. I didn't want crowds, didn't want families with screaming kids or loud groups blaring music from portable speakers. I wanted solitude. I found a place deep in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from home. A long, winding dirt road led to the trailhead, and by the time I got there, my car was the only one in the small gravel parking lot. That was a good sign. I took my time checking my gear before heading in. Backpack loaded with food, water, tent, and emergency supplies. A map, a compass, a flashlight with extra batteries. I even had a satellite phone just in case. I wasn't careless. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well defined, though clearly not used often. Fallen leaves covered the dirt path, crunching under my boots as I walked. The forest was dense, but the sunlight filtered through in streaks, warm and golden. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was exactly what I needed. By midday, I had covered about 6 miles. I stopped near a creek, ate a protein bar, and drank some water while listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. No cars, no voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of a bird. I felt good. That feeling didn't last. After my break, I got back on the trail. The plan was to go another 4 or 5 miles before setting up camp for the night. The path started to get rougher. Not difficult, just less maintained. Fallen branches forced me to step carefully, and parts of the trail were narrow, with steep drop-offs to one side. That's when I saw the first sign that something was off. A boot print. It was old, partially washed out from rain, but it was there. Someone had been through here before me, which wasn't strange on its own. But what was strange was how deep it was. Like whoever left it had been carrying something heavy. I didn't think much of it at first, just something I noticed. I kept walking. The trees grew thicker, the sunlight dimming as the canopy closed in above me. The trail felt different now, more overgrown, less defined. I checked my map. I was still on the right path, at least I should have been. Then I saw the second footprint. This one was fresher, and it wasn't alone. There were several, all leading in the same direction I was going. But something was wrong with them. They weren't normal hiking steps. They were erratic, spaced unevenly, like someone had been stumbling or limping. A cold feeling settled in my gut. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone had gotten tired, maybe they had a bad knee. There were 100 explanations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept moving. The trail got worse. The further I went, the less it looked like a real hiking path. The trees grew closer, the underbrush thickening. I checked my map again. I should have reached a fork in the trail by now, a spot marked on the map where the path split. One route leading to a scenic overlook, the other continuing deeper into the forest. But there was no fork, just an unbroken stretch of trees in every direction. I stopped, took a deep breath. I had been following the trail. I hadn't gone off course, but now the trail wasn't there. I turned around. The path behind me was gone. That wasn't possible. I had just come from there. But when I looked back, all I saw were trees, thick and unbroken. The footprints, mine included, were gone. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering, trying to make sense of it. The air felt heavier. The forest was silent.
No birds.
No wind. Then I heard it. A sound. Faint, distant, like something moving through the trees. Not an animal. Something bigger. I turned in slow circles, scanning the forest. Nothing. Just trees, stretching in every direction. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay calm. Took out my compass. The needle spun uselessly, refusing to settle. That shouldn't have been possible. I pulled out my map, but it felt pointless. None of the landmarks matched what I was seeing. The landscape around me was different from what had been marked. I wasn't lost. Something else was wrong. I picked a direction and started walking. I needed to find anything familiar, a landmark, a clearing, even just a way out of the thick trees. I kept my breathing steady, moving carefully, trying not to panic. Then I saw it. A structure. Not a house, not a cabin. Something smaller. A metal cage. It sat in a small clearing, rusted and old. Too big for an animal trap, too small for a proper holding cell. The bars were bent in places, the door hanging open. And inside, something lay crumpled on the ground. Bones. A mix of animal and human. I stared at it, stomach twisting. Then, behind me, I heard movement. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't turn around. I walked. Then I walked faster. Then I ran. Branches tore at my arms. Roots tried to trip me, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until I thought I was going to collapse. Then suddenly I was back at the trailhead. I don't remember how I got there. One moment, I was deep in the woods, running from something I never saw. The next, I was standing beside my car, gasping for breath, covered in scratches and dirt. I didn't question it. I just got in my car and drove. I never went back. Some places aren't meant to be found. I've always been comfortable in the woods, maybe too comfortable. I've spent years hiking, camping, and exploring deep forests, the kind where you don't see another person for miles, where the only sounds are the wind through the trees, the distant call of birds, and the crunch of your own boots on the dirt. I always thought I knew the woods, but this trip changed that. I set out early, my pack loaded with everything I needed for a few days alone in the backcountry. The weather was perfect, cool, dry, with a light breeze. My plan was to follow an old, unmarked game trail deep into the mountains, an area few people ever went. That's what I liked about it. By midday, I was miles from the nearest road. The forest was thick, the trees towering above me, their branches blocking out most of the sky. The further I hiked, the quieter it got. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the woods. It was perfect, or at least it should have been. I first noticed it when I stopped to rest. The silence, not the normal, peaceful stillness of the forest. This was different. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I was deep enough into the woods that maybe the usual animal sounds were just further away. But the feeling stuck with me. Something was off. By late afternoon, I found a good spot to set up camp, a small clearing beside a narrow stream. The place looked untouched, like no one had camped there in years. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and sat back, listening. Still nothing. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. Then, in the distance, a sound. Faint, almost too quiet to notice. A sharp, clicking noise. It came from somewhere deep in the trees. At first, I thought it was a branch creaking in the wind, but there was no wind. I sat still, listening. The clicking came again. Rhythmic, deliberate. I tried to place it, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew. And it was getting closer. As the sun dipped below the trees, I forced myself to ignore the unease in my gut. I ate a quick meal, kept my fire burning bright, and sat with my back to a tree, scanning the darkness beyond the flames. That's when I saw it. Movement, something shifting in the trees, just beyond the firelight. Not walking, not running, perched, a shadow high up in the branches, clinging to the side of a tree. I narrowed my eyes, trying to make out the shape. It was big, too big to be a bird. Its body was long, thin, with wings folded against its sides. Its head wrong, stretched. It was watching me. I didn't move. For a long moment, neither of us did. Then, with a slow, unnatural motion, it tilted its head to the side. A clicking sound filled the air, coming from its throat. I gripped my knife, heart hammering in my chest. Then it moved, not like a bird taking flight, not like an animal climbing down a tree. It dropped, straight down, and the second it hit the ground, it vanished into the darkness. I stayed awake the entire night, gripping my knife, the fire burning low beside me. The clicking never stopped. The first light, I broke camp and moved fast. I didn't eat, didn't stop for water. I just hiked. The further I got from that campsite, the more I told myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the light, my mind playing games after too much time alone. But then I saw the tracks. Not human, not bird, something in between. Long, clawed impressions in the dirt, three-pronged, like talons, and they followed me. I moved faster. The trees were denser here, the path harder to follow, but I kept pushing forward. My plan was to cut my trip short and make it back to my truck by nightfall. But I wasn't alone. Every few minutes, I'd hear it. The clicking, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always following. I forced myself not to run. Running in the woods was a good way to get hurt, to get lost. but my body screamed at me to move faster. I hiked for hours, legs burning, lungs tight. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, a shadow moved. Ahead of me, it had circled around, cut me off. I skidded to a stop, heart slamming against my ribs. The creature perched on a low-hanging branch, its body half hidden by the leaves. It was closer now. I could see its skin, gray, leathery, stretched tight over its thin frame. Its eyes were empty, its mouth too wide. And then, it did something that made my blood run cold. It mimicked me, tilted its head, raised an arm, a wing, like it was mocking my movements. Then it dropped from the tree again, disappearing into the brush. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't care about the risk of falling. I just ran. The forest blurred around me, branches clawing at my face, my pack slamming against my back. The clicking was everywhere now. Close. Behind me, ahead of me, above me. I burst into a clearing, my truck finally in sight, parked just where I left it. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see it. I just threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt, my hands shaking on the wheel. Only when I hit the highway did I finally glance in the rearview mirror. The forest stood still, empty, but the silence stayed with me, like something was still listening. I never went back to that area. I still hike, still camp, but I don't go alone anymore. And every so often, in the dead of night, I wake up in my bed, heart pounding. Because sometimes, even miles from the woods, I swear I hear the clicking. I had been planning this trip for months. A full week alone in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no people, just me and the quiet of nature. I had done plenty of solo camping before, but this trip was different. I wanted to go deeper than ever, to a place where I was truly alone. I found the perfect spot after weeks of research. A remote patch of forest, miles from any established trails or campsites. I checked satellite images, scoured maps, made sure there were no roads anywhere nearby. I wanted isolation, and I found it. I packed everything carefully. A durable tent, a warm sleeping bag, a small camp stove, plenty of food and water, a hatchet, a knife, a fire starter. I always carried a GPS and a paper map as backup. I didn't bring a gun, I never had before. The drive took most of the day. I followed a series of winding dirt roads, each one rougher than the last, until I reached the point where the forest took over. From there, I hiked. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles that muffled my steps. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I found my campsite just before dusk, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by towering trees. The ground was flat, dry. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and built a small fire as the last light faded. I ate my meal sitting on a fallen log, watching the flames dance. That first night was uneventful. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of an animal moving through the undergrowth. Nothing out of place. I slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over moss-covered rocks, taking in the stillness of the woods. The air smelled fresh, clean. I didn't see any signs of people. No old fire pits, no footprints, no trash. I hiked for hours, eventually looping back toward camp as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. And that's when I saw it. A tree stripped of its bark. The raw wood beneath was carved with deep, uneven cuts. Not from an animal, not from weather. It was deliberate. I stood there, staring at it, feeling the first twinge of unease. I told myself it was old. Maybe someone had been here years ago. Maybe it was nothing. I walked back to camp, shaking off the feeling. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The woods were quieter than before. No wind, no distant animal sounds, just stillness. I went to bed, trying not to let my mind wander. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my campsite. I froze, listening. The steps circled my tent. Then they stopped. I held my breath. The silence stretched. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep because I woke up to daylight. Everything looked normal. The fire had burned down to embers. My gear was undisturbed. But on the edge of my camp, near the trees, I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They led from the woods, circled my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. The hike back to my truck felt endless. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. The forest was too quiet. I reached my truck by early afternoon. The door was unlocked. Inside, nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment was open, papers scattered. I started the engine, locked the doors, and drove. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the mirror. At the edge of the trees, someone was standing, watching. I never went back. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I was just tired of the noise of everyday life. Or maybe I was just being stupid. Either way, when my friend Matt told me about his uncle's cabin and how he needed someone to watch over it for a week, I said yes. The idea of being alone in the woods didn't scare me at first. I'd gone camping before, spent nights outdoors, and I figured a week away from work and distractions would be good for me. No emails, no meetings, no people. Just me, a few books, and the sound of nature. But the moment I turned onto that dirt road leading to the cabin, something felt off. The trees pressed in too close. The road was barely wide enough for my car. The sun was starting to set, and the light filtering through the trees cast long shadows that made everything look stretched and distorted. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place getting to me. I kept driving. After a few more miles, the cabin came into view. It was smaller than I expected, just a simple wooden structure with a sagging porch and a single window on the front. There was no other house for miles. No cell service either. My bars had disappeared almost an hour ago. I parked, got out and stretched. The air was cool, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. The silence was absolute. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no planes overhead, just trees. I grabbed my bag and headed up to the porch. The key was right where Matt said it would be, under a loose board near the door. The lock was stiff, the door heavier than it looked, but it creaked open after a few tries. Inside, the air was stale, like no one had been there in a while. The cabin was one large room, bed in the corner, small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs. There was a fireplace, a few oil lamps on the shelves, and a single door leading to what I assumed was the bathroom. It wasn't cozy, but it was enough. I set my bag down, checked the supplies Matt had left: canned food, bottled water, a flashlight with extra batteries. There was no electricity, just an old propane stove for cooking and a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. I lit a fire, made some soup, and ate in silence. Outside, the trees swayed slightly in the wind. I tried to let the quiet relax me, but it didn't. Felt wrong, like the forest was watching. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dull red glow. Then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate crunch outside. Footsteps. I held my breath. The sound moved, circling the cabin. Slow, careful, not an animal. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The only weapon I had was a hunting knife Matt had left in one of the kitchen drawers. Another step, closer now. Then it stopped. I strained my ears, waiting. Nothing, just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I let out a slow breath. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind shifting the leaves. I told myself that over and over, but I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came and everything looked normal.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been out there. I told myself I had overreacted. I spent the day keeping busy, chopping wood, checking the nearby stream for fresh water, trying to enjoy the solitude. But the feeling never left. The sense that I wasn't alone. That night, I locked the door, bolted the windows, kept the knife within reach. It didn't help. The knocking started just past midnight. Soft, slow. Knock, knock, knock. Not at the door, at the window. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat. The window had no curtains, no way to block out whatever was outside. I didn't move. The knocking came again. I forced myself to look. Nothing, just the darkness pressing against the glass. I sat in bed, gripping the knife, waiting. The knocking never came again, but I didn't sleep. I woke up exhausted, every muscle tense. I stepped outside, scanning the ground, and then I saw them. Footprints.
Bore.
Human, circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been out there, watching me. I packed my things in under 10 minutes. I grabbed my keys, threw open the car door. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. The battery cables were gone. Not loose. Gone. A sound behind me, a soft rustling in the trees. I turned, scanning the forest. Nothing, but I knew someone was there, watching, waiting. I grabbed the knife and backed toward the cabin. If I couldn't leave, I needed to survive the night. I barricaded the door, stacked furniture against it, kept the knife in my hand. The knocking started at midnight, not just at the window this time. The walls, the door, soft, deliberate taps, like they were playing with me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the doorknob turned. Slow, testing. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. The sound stopped. Silence. Then footsteps. Leaving. circling, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep, didn't move, just waited for morning. First light, I ran. I didn't pack, didn't look back, just sprinted down the dirt road, heart hammering. I ran for almost an hour before I saw another car. An older man driving a pickup. He slowed when he saw me, eyes wide. I must have looked insane. He drove me to the nearest town. I called Matt, told him everything. He didn't sound surprised. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "My uncle stopped going up there too. I never asked why. I didn't want to know. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, when everything is too quiet, I swear I still hear knocking." I don't know how to explain what I saw out there. I've been in the woods my whole life. Hunting, fishing, hiking, hell, I even spent a summer working in a fire lookout tower. But I've never felt afraid out there, not until that night. It started like any other hunting trip. Late October, the air crisp and cool, the leaves mostly fallen, the woods starting to settle into that empty stillness before winter. I had a good spot, deep in the woods where I knew deer passed through. It was far from any roads or trails, a place only hunters and the occasional lost hiker would ever step foot in. I got out there in the late afternoon, moving slow, careful not to make too much noise. The ground was damp from rain a few days before, which helped keep my steps quiet. I found a good spot near a clearing, climbed up into my tree stand, and settled in. The first few hours passed normally. Birds called out in the distance, the occasional rustle of a squirrel moving through the leaves. As the sun started to set, I saw movement on the far side of the clearing. A buck, stepping carefully out from the trees, nose in the air, testing the wind. I watched, waiting. It was a good size, but I was looking for something bigger. Then, as the light faded, something changed. The woods got too quiet. No birds, no wind, just a dead, heavy silence. Anyone who's spent time in the deep woods knows that feeling. When everything goes still like that, it usually means a predator is nearby. I figured maybe a bear was moving through or even a cougar. I tightened my grip on my rifle just in case. But then I saw it. First, I thought it was another deer. It stepped out from the trees on the opposite side of the clearing, just beyond where the buck had been. But something was wrong. It moved strangely, too stiff, too slow. The buck bolted as soon as it saw the thing, crashing back into the trees without hesitation. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Deer don't run like that unless they're truly scared. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The last bit of daylight was almost gone, but there was enough to see it clearly. It was standing on two legs. My brain tried to make sense of it. Person? Some idiot in a deer costume? But no, it was wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs too long. It looked like a deer, but it wasn't. The antlers were there, the fur, even the shape of the head, but its eyes were different. Too far forward, like a predator's. And then it turned toward me. I don't know how it knew I was there. I hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. But it turned, slow and deliberate, and it saw me. I felt it. That thing wasn't just looking, it was aware. My breath caught in my throat. My body screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but I forced myself to stay still. I gripped my rifle tighter. It wasn't a person. I knew that much, and if it wasn't a person, that meant I could shoot it. I raised the rifle, steadying my aim, finger on the trigger. But before I could fire, it moved. Not fast, slow, purposeful. It stepped forward, placing one long, thin leg in front of the other, balancing perfectly, like it had always walked that way, like it belonged that way. My hands shook. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I lined up my shot, aimed for the chest, and pulled the trigger. The sound shattered the silence. Perfect shot, dead center. Any normal deer would have dropped right there. But this thing didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. The bullet hit, it had to have hit. But it just kept moving, stepping forward, slow and deliberate. My stomach dropped. I chambered another round, my breath coming fast and shallow. I fired again. Nothing. I don't know how, but I knew that shooting it wouldn't do anything. It wasn't right. It wasn't natural. Then it did something I'll never forget. It opened its mouth. Not a normal deer's mouth. Wider, wrong. And then it screamed. I've heard the sound of a wounded animal before. I've heard deer cry out after being shot. This wasn't that. This was something else. It was high and shrill, almost human, but not quite. It was like a person trying to scream through a throat that wasn't made for it. It went on, rising and falling, like it was calling out to something. And then, from the trees behind me, I heard movement. Not just one thing, many. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, more footsteps. I didn't wait to see what they were. I climbed down from my stand so fast I nearly fell. As soon as my boots hit the ground, I ran. I didn't care about being quiet, didn't care about anything except getting the hell away from that place. Branches tore at my clothes, my pack snagging on bushes, but I didn't stop. I ran until my legs burned, until my chest ached, until I couldn't hear anything behind me. Finally, I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. My headlights lit up the tree line in front of me, and for one terrible moment, I thought I'd see it standing there. But the woods were empty. I drove out of there like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. I never went back to that spot. Hell, I don't go deep into the woods at all anymore, not alone, because I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there. I don't know how long I've been sitting here, staring at my hands. They won't stop shaking. My knuckles are raw, split open in places, dirt packed into the cracks. I should clean them. I should get up, but I can't. My pack is still lying a few feet away, half open, some of my gear spilling onto the dirt. My boots are caked in dried mud, one of the laces torn. My shirt, ripped, stained with things I don't want to think about. I made it out, but I don't know if I'll ever go back into the woods again. The plan I had planned the trip for weeks. A solo hike through the backcountry, 3 days, maybe 4. No marked trails, no campgrounds, just me and the wilderness. I'd done it before. I was careful, I was prepared. I picked a section of forest in the Pacific Northwest. A place with no real trails, just old logging roads and animal paths. A place where I wouldn't run into anyone. I wanted the quiet. I packed everything I needed, enough food, a water filter, extra layers. I had my map, my compass, a GPS. I wasn't an idiot. I should have been fine. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the smell of pine thick in the morning air. The hike was tough. Steep climbs, loose rocks, thick underbrush, but nothing I couldn't handle. By midday, I was deep in the woods. No roads, no power lines, no signs of people. Exactly what I wanted. I set up camp near a small creek, cooked dinner, stretched out by the fire, listened to the wind move through the trees. I felt at home. I had no idea how bad things were about to get. The first sign the second day, I kept moving west. The forest got denser. The trees pressed closer together, their trunks thick and gnarled. The ground was uneven, roots twisting up like veins. That's when I found the first sign that something was wrong. A tree stripped of its bark, not just scratched, peeled. The wood underneath was smooth, pale, like something had torn at it with careful, deliberate hands. At first, I thought it was a bear. They do that sometimes, clawing at trees for food. But there were no claw marks, no bite marks. Just the bare wood exposed like bone. I kept walking. A mile later, I found another, then another. A straight line, leading deeper into the forest. I don't know why I followed it. The clearing, it was late afternoon when I found the clearing. The trees opened up suddenly, like something had ripped them away. The ground was bare, no grass, no underbrush, just dirt, packed tight, littered with dead leaves. And in the center, a pile of bones. They weren't human, deer maybe, smaller animals mixed in, stripped clean, stacked neatly. I crouched down, my stomach tight. The bones were fresh, not bleached by the sun, not buried under leaves. Something had been here recently. Watching, I left the clearing fast. The noise that night, I didn't sleep well. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, making them creak and groan. My fire burned low, casting flickering shadows. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sound, a dull, rhythmic thudding, like something heavy hitting wood. I sat up, my pulse hammering. Came again. Closer. Thud. Pause. Thud. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't an animal moving through the brush. It was deliberate, measured, like something knocking on a tree. I gripped my knife, my breath coming fast. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, a branch falling. But I didn't sleep. The third day by morning, the woods felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker, the air heavier. I packed fast and started moving east, back toward my car. I wasn't panicked, not yet, but I knew I didn't want to be out here anymore. By noon, I realized I was going the wrong way. I checked my compass. The needle spun wildly before settling, pointing south. That was wrong. I checked my GPS. No signal. I checked my map. It didn't make sense. The landmarks didn't line up. The hills, the ridges, they were all wrong. I turned north. I walked for hours. Then I saw it. The clearing. The same one. The pile of bones was gone. The descent into fear I ran. I don't remember how far, how long. My pack slammed against my back, branches whipping my arms. My lungs burned, my legs ached. Eventually, I stopped. The forest was silent. No wind.
No birds.
Nothing. I checked my compass again. The needle was spinning. I turned in a slow circle, my breath ragged. Then, just ahead, a tree, stripped of its bark. I had been walking in circles. The stalker, I tried to stay calm, tried to think. I needed to find high ground, get my bearings. I climbed the nearest ridge, my legs shaking. At the top, I scanned the horizon. Nothing but trees, endless, unbroken. Then movement. Far below, between the trees, a shape, tall, thin, not moving like an animal, not moving like a person. Watching, I dropped to the ground, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed. When I looked again, it was gone. The last night, I didn't stop moving until nightfall. I made a fire, kept my back to a rock face, my knife in my hand. I didn't eat, didn't sleep. Then, near midnight, footsteps. Soft, careful, circling. I gripped my knife so hard my fingers went numb. The footsteps stopped. Then, just beyond the firelight, a shape. Standing, watching, too tall, too thin, not right. I didn't move. I didn't blink. It stayed there for hours. Then it stepped back, melted into the trees. Gone. The escape at dawn, I ran. No thought, no direction, just movement. Hours blurred together. My legs burned. My lungs screamed. Then the road. I stumbled onto the asphalt, nearly collapsing. My car was there, right where I left it. I didn't look back. I drove until I hit the nearest town. I checked my GPS, my map. Something was wrong. The forest I had been in, the place I had spent 3 days, it wasn't there. Not on any map. I don't know where I was. I don't think I ever will. But I know this, I'll never go back. I had planned the trip for months. A solo hike through the Cascade Mountains, deep into the wilderness, miles away from any sign of civilization. The route I mapped out would take me through thick forests, across ridges, and down into valleys few people ever saw. It was exactly what I wanted. Complete solitude, surrounded by nature, nothing but my own strength and skill to keep me going. I packed everything carefully. My backpack was heavy with food, water, gear, and emergency supplies. My boots were broken in, my layers planned for the unpredictable mountain weather. I even had a satellite beacon in case something went seriously wrong. I had done solo trips before, but nothing this remote, nothing this demanding. This was the real test. The first day was perfect. The trail was steep, but my legs were fresh, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. The sun broke through the trees in golden beams, lighting up the moss-covered ground. I followed the trail up into the hills, climbing higher, leaving behind the last signs of human activity. By midday, I had reached the ridgeline, a narrow path cutting along the mountain with steep drop-offs on either side. The view stretched for miles, endless forested slopes rolling toward the horizon, untouched, wild. That night, I set up camp by a small alpine lake. The water was so clear I could see the smooth stones at the bottom. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. I ate, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and felt completely at peace. The second day, I pushed deeper. The trail became rougher, barely more than an old game path in some places. I had to watch my footing constantly, stepping over exposed roots, loose rocks, patches of mud. I kept moving, pacing myself, drinking water, eating small handfuls of nuts and dried fruit to keep my energy up. I crossed a narrow stream around midday and decided to refill my water bottles. As I crouched by the bank, filtering the cold, clear water, I noticed something strange, a footprint in the mud. It was fresh, the edges still crisp. Not an animal print, a human boot. That didn't make sense. I had followed a rarely used route, far from any maintained trails. The last sign of people I had seen was miles back. Maybe someone had passed through before me, but the print looked too fresh, made within the last few hours. I scanned the area. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth, silent and undisturbed. No sounds of movement, no other tracks nearby. I kept going. Maybe another hiker had the same idea as me, taking this off-trail route. It was strange, but not impossible. I hiked for hours, climbing over fallen logs, pushing through dense brush, my legs burning with effort. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow valley with steep rock walls on either side. The air was cooler here, the sun already disappearing behind the cliffs. The map showed a faint trail cutting through, leading up the other side toward another ridge. I followed it, moving carefully over loose scree and sharp rocks. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A backpack, torn open, lying against the base of the cliff. It was old, sun-bleached, the fabric shredded as if animals had gotten to it. But it hadn't been there long. There was no moss, no dirt buildup. It looked like it had been abandoned months ago, maybe a year at most. I nudged it with my boot. Empty. No supplies, no ID, nothing to say who it belonged to. My mind raced. Had someone gotten hurt here? Had they fallen? I scanned the cliffside, but there was no sign of bones, no remnants of clothing caught on the rocks. I checked my map again. I was miles from any known campsite. This place wasn't on any official trails. The light was fading fast. I needed to find a place to camp before dark. I hiked another mile up the valley and found a flat spot beneath a rocky overhang. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something outside the tent. Every sound, the wind shifting through the trees, the rustle of leaves, felt wrong, too close, too deliberate. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, careful, stopping just beyond the thin fabric wall. I held my breath. Nothing. I waited, listening, my muscles tensed. Still nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation getting to me, but I kept my knife close, gripping it tight until my fingers ached. By dawn, I was already packed and moving. I didn't want to stay there any longer than I had to. The trail climbed sharply, taking me up and out of the valley. My legs burned, my pack felt heavier than before. The silence pressed down on me.
No birds, no insects.
Just the sound of my own breathing, my own footsteps crunching over dirt and stone. Then I saw it. Another footprint, fresh, and this time it wasn't mine. I stared at it, my skin prickling. Someone else was out here, someone moving in the same direction as me. I kept hiking faster now, pushing myself. I wanted to be out of this area, back on a real trail, anywhere but here. My lungs burned, my pulse hammered in my ears. Then, ahead on the trail, something moved. A shape half hidden by the trees. Tall, human. I froze. The figure stood there, just beyond the edge of the trail, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then it stepped back, vanishing into the trees. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I ran until my legs nearly gave out, until I reached the next ridgeline, where the terrain was too open for anyone to follow me unseen. I kept going, pushing through exhaustion, fear, everything screaming at me to get out. By nightfall, I found a spot far from the trail, hidden between boulders. I barely slept, my knife in my hand, every nerve on edge. The next morning, I moved fast. I hiked for hours, barely stopping, drinking water as I walked, ignoring the pain in my feet. By late afternoon, I reached a marked trail, a real official trail. I had never felt so relieved. I followed it all the way down, my heart pounding with every step. When I finally saw the parking lot, my car sitting exactly where I left it, I almost collapsed. I never found out who was out there. No missing persons reports, no news of lost hikers. Nothing, just footprints in the dirt, and the feeling that somewhere in those mountains, someone was still watching.